My job here, at least for today, is weird. So I'm not a differential privacy person at all, and yet I'm here. My purpose today is to talk about things I do know. That's not differential privacy, but I am familiar with a whole bunch of privacy mechanisms, or sort of wannabe privacy mechanisms, if you will, that don't work. And we're going to spend this morning talking about those things that look superficially plausible, but I'll convince you that they're no good. And after I've done my convincing, then like real differential privacy people can get on stage and tell you about what the true answer is. But let's first talk about what people were doing before differential privacy appeared on the stage, so to speak. The problem of protecting information, kind of everybody knows it's a problem, and it's getting worse all the time because information is being collected on a pretty large scale. So these days, everything you do online and increasingly offline, but certainly online, every click you make, these days, every mouse movement you make in the browser, every interaction with a mobile app is probably being collected and recorded somewhere. So, and this includes all kinds of information, things like preferences and tastes that people express when they like something or dislike something. Commercial transactions they perform. There are huge companies that make very profitable use of this information by monetizing it and extracting some intelligence from it about how to sell things better. Social networks is another type of data, another type of kind of computational artifact that is big companies, you know, Facebooks and LinkedIn's and lots of other companies of the world are making a lot of money monetizing. And some people are very worried about protecting that information, what could be inferred from that, and so on and so forth. Medical data, including both purely biological data, like genetic data, but also care records, various healthcare-related information about outcomes, information about drugs, how patients react to these drugs, clinical information, that's all being collected, and people are trying, for example, these days to apply machine learning to it. This has but the underlying data has obvious privacy issues, so that's another huge area where people worry about privacy. Web tracking, I already mentioned, there are lots of companies that are in the business of tracking like every click made anywhere, trying to extract something useful from it and target advertising better. Interesting. Okay, so all of this involves data collection on a large scale. Often it includes aggregation of online information and offline information. This is a pretty huge business these days. Look at online activities and trying to combine them with like offline information like mortgage records and birth records and demographics and whatnot and so on. So this raises obvious privacy issues, and if you talk to people who are doing this kind of thing that I just talked about, information collection and monetization, what about privacy? They always give you the same answer, which is there are really no privacy issues at all to worry about in all of this data collection because information we collect is anonymous. That's what they always tell you. We do not collect any personal identifiable information. We just get a record of visits to websites, a record of interaction with mobile apps. Maybe we get social network data, but all names have been removed from that social data. And that distinction is very, very important because every time somebody tries to regulate them or complains about privacy, they always give an answer that we do not share information with anyone in a personal identifiable form. So this magic incantation, personal identifiable, is somehow very important because it's sort of, if it's not personal identifiable, then it's safe to share. So the standard solution that people use is anonymize the data. So take the data, remove everything personal identifiable from it. Now it's not linkable to identity. Now it's safe to share. So this is really the key to privacy as it's practiced in the world today. That's what people actually do with real data, not like computer scientists, but like people who work in industry. And if you just do like a Google search for some phrase like "we do not collect personally identifiable information," you find a lot of hits, like dozens of millions of hits. Yeah, a lot. So, and that's kind of a state-of-the-art solution. And as a matter of fact, this concept of PII, of personally identifiable information, made its way even in like US government standards. So NIST in the US even publishes like a whole guide to protecting confidentiality of PII. And like if you look at something like this, you might even think that like, man, this PII thing, that's like pretty real if like the government is publishing guides to protecting it. So my purpose today, I have several purposes, but one of my purposes will be myth busting, okay? I'll try to convince you that like Sasquatch, PII doesn't actually exist, that there is no such thing as PII, and that whenever they talk about removing PII or provide guides to protecting PII or talk about anonymizing data by somehow processing PII, they don't know what they're talking about. So the whole model, it's not just a mental model, it's actually what people actually try to do when they process data. So this thing is actually like implemented in software. And there are many ways of doing it, but they all have like this model in mind, is that you take sensitive data, okay? Databases containing like any kind of data that I was talking about before, whether it's commercial transactions or preferences or records of people's behavior. So you have a data set containing something sensitive. And then you put it through some process, and I'll tell you about several ways of doing this today. And you can call it anonymization, some people call it de-identification, some people call it sanitization, but it basically consists of some magic transformation that removes PI from it. And all the sins are washed away in this process, and data emerges in some kind of saintly, de-identified form, okay? At which point it's anonymous and it's, it's good to use, okay? You now have privacy because all of PII, all the bad things that enable privacy attacks, all the PII is gone from the processed data, and without PII it's been anonymized and sanitized and de-identified, and now it's actually used. Actually, like you can use it for whatever purpose you want. You can publish it, you can share it with advertisers because it's in this saintly form. There isn't even like a restriction on any computation you could do with it because all the risks have been removed from this data. So that's the whole like pipeline, if you will, of privacy-preserving data release. That's how it was 15 years ago or 10 years ago. And actually, to some extent, it's still true today, although a little less so for various reasons that I'll briefly mention. The concept of de-identifying data is also linked to another concept. I mean, it's not quite the same, but they tend to be closely related. Another thing that I will try to debunk today. And that's the interpretation of privacy as access control. So you often hear about various privacy concepts that are promulgated in industry and certainly in regulation and occasionally even in sort of kind of thinking about privacy that, well, it's your data, so you should be able to control it. Okay, so ownership and control of the data is important. If we give people control over their data and give them some tools for access control, that'll solve privacy problems that, if they haven't been solved by anonymization. But if you think about this for a moment, that's kind of like, for many types of data that I described, that doesn't even make any sense, because if you think about social networks, the data is obviously shared. In case of genetic information, it's not even clear like what access control there means because people share their genetic material with relatives. And I'll also show you that there are ways, even in systems that have very strong forms of access control, later today I'll show you that it's often possible to infer what the data is just by interacting with the system through its permitted interfaces. Well, I kind of gave you, I'll describe concrete mechanisms in a moment, but hopefully I've given you some kind of very general idea of how people think about privacy and protecting privacy. And somehow, like, that doesn't seem to help. As in, over the past 10, 15 years, we've seen any number of pretty massive privacy scandals and privacy breaches. So I'm most familiar with the ones that happened in the US, but I'm sure it happens everywhere. So it seems like every couple of years we get some kind of major headline-grabbing privacy incident where somebody released the data and then somebody learned something from this data they should not have learned. So it would be very instructive, I feel, at least from my perspective, to understand what went wrong and in particular, like, what is it in the processes that were used to protect privacy of the data? In what way they're flawed? I guess the whole goal of this school is to learn about differential privacy, and my sense is that it'll be very helpful to actually understand what went wrong in all of these scenarios, because it turns out that a lot of it provides pretty good motivation for differential privacy, or at any rate, why things that came before differential privacy just don't seem to be doing the job. So I'm going to put like sort of a few papers up here. One of them mine. As you can see, they're fairly old at this point, like 10 years old, and one is 20 years old. I should mention, though, that this whole area of extracting information from anonymized data sets is much older than that, much, much older. And I recently actually went through the exercise of kind of trying to trace the chain of papers going all the way back to inference control and statistical databases and record linkage and so on. And I was actually amazed like how old the earliest paper on extracting information from anonymized data sets is. I was kind of humbled. Turns out like the oldest paper I could find is like from 1957, believe it or not. And if you read that paper, a lot of the stuff that's in this more modern paper is sort of already there in some form. I still like these three papers because they sort of show on very concrete examples how these things work. But in terms of techniques being used here, these are not new techniques. Abstractly, a lot of techniques for record linkage, the kind of stuff I'm going to be talking about today, how to extract information when you know a little bit about what's in the anonymized data set, but not everything, about approximate record matching, about various forms of inference, goes back certainly to the early 70s and late 60s, and the oldest paper I could find was like 1956. I actually didn't put, well, I wanted to put it on this slide, but I didn't want to mess up those beautiful printouts they made here, so I didn't put it on the slide. But you can ask me afterwards. Oh, it's just like two like Hungarian names on it. I can't pronounce them, but I'll. It's actually that was so Kobe. That I recommend, that exercise of tracing back the papers. I found it very illuminating, and reading those papers was very interesting. Actually, they're very accessible too. All right, so let's talk about some anonymization techniques. Let's just see what people do out there when they talk about privacy protection. So here is, sorry, this slide is actually somehow mistitled. This was a mistake in my slides. I fixed it, but it's not in this version. So here we have a medical data set, which has names and some demographic information and medical conditions, obviously sensitive. So you can see the names here. So the standard way of protecting privacy, such as it is, of this data set is remove the names. Okay, that's the first thing that comes to mind. That's what people are doing. That's what HIPAA, the US privacy law, prescribes. So you remove the names. At this point, you might think the data set has been de-identified. And the most kind of standard famous attack is taking some other data set that has some attributes in common. So in this case, you take voter registration data. That's a very popular source for these kinds of attacks because, for example, in the US, in many, it's always publicly available, but in many states it's available for free, so you can get the whole table of registered voters, which has names, zip codes, and all kinds of demographic information. And then you just join these two data sets on common attributes, which obviously allows you to connect these data sets and infer some information about this. So this attack was done for reals, in the wild, so to speak, by Latanya Sweeney. It's a very famous attack that this year we'll be celebrating 20 years of that paper being published, where she effectively performed this attack. So she took a Massachusetts hospital discharge data set, which contains anonymized data, but what anonymized means in this case is that social security numbers and names have been removed from it. She took public voter list in Massachusetts, has to be public by law, and joined them. And by joining them, she discovered the record of William Weld, who was the governor of Massachusetts at the time. And, that's basic, very basic way of re-identification. Just take two data sets, one containing names, the other not containing names, join them on common attributes. So this kind of, so that's sort of re-identification 101. And what this immediately tells you is that, names is not going to be enough. There is something else in here that allows this attack to proceed. And like this whole idea of having attributes in common, plus these attributes being identified. So that's this idea of a quasi-identifier, okay? So quasi-identifier is a combination of attributes which is not a name, okay? So, but it still uniquely identifies an individual. For example, name, address, and phone number is a quasi-identifier, okay? Because actually, probably just a phone number these days is a quasi-identifier. Back in the day when most people had landlines, maybe people shared the phone, but certainly name in combination with phone number. No, sorry, what am I saying here? No, those are primary identifiers. Sorry, it's like 3 in the morning, so, so I don't even know what I'm saying. All right, so what I'm trying to draw the distinction here between things like social security numbers and phone numbers, which like are uniquely identifying and belong to one person, and combinations of attributes that are not like that, but yet are identifying. So the famous quasi-identifier that comes from Latanya Sweeney's work is the combination of zip code, birth date, and gender, which happens to, according to her calculations, uniquely identify something like 87% of population in the US. So if you just know the exact birth date, gender, and zip code, in most zip codes, so another way of looking at it is like most zip codes in America, combination of birth date and gender is uniquely identified. So it doesn't give you the identity, okay? But because it's unique, it provides a way of taking a data set that has that quasi-identifier and identity and linking it with a data set that doesn't have the identity on the quasi-identifier attribute. So this is what enables to perform this database joins and guarantees that the result of the join is like you're going to get a unique record for the individual. This introduces some subtlety into how to think about database privacy. So like if we look at medical data set, we're going to see like key attributes. So these are your kind of primary identifiers. And you're also going to see things like quasi-identifiers. And I'm sorry, there is again a mistake that I fixed on my version of the slide and didn't fix here. That left vertical line has to be one column to the left. So like the name would be the key attribute, the quasi-identifier would be date of birth, gender, and zip code. And then there is some sensitive information which contains, in this case, things like medical conditions. And so there is a belief, I don't actually know like on what it's based, but there is a belief that in order for data to be useful, the information on this insensitive attribute, sort of the payload of the data, so to speak, has to be released unmodified, okay? I keep hearing this all the time, and I'm going to come back to this argument maybe either later today, but probably most likely on Wednesday. Like, people believe that if you don't release that part on the right unmodified, patients will die. Like, that's the literal sentence that I hear like all the time. Like, you cannot be adding like anything, you cannot be modifying this information on the right in any way. You could not be adding any noise, you could not be doing anything because people will die. So we'll come back to that. But for now, you see, like, there are sort of primary identifiers, there are quasi-identifiers and sensitive attributes. And so Latanya Sweeney came with this notion, this idea of privacy that is still extremely influential and used heavily. It's used, for example, like Facebook, like pays like some consulting companies millions of dollars to perform this kind of transformation on their data. And that's the idea of K-anonymity. So the reasoning goes roughly as follows. So why did the attack that I showed you before, this joining with a voter database, why did it succeed? It's because even if you remove the name, for every quasi-identifier, you have a unique record in the data set. So in this hospital discharge data set, every quasi-identifier is associated with one record. So if I find an external source of information, like a voting list, which has the same quasi-identifier, I will be able to join. That's no good. So let's foil this attack the best way we know how, which is, well, let's make sure that for every quasi-identifier that appears in the data set, there are at least K-1 other records in the data set that have the same quasi-identifier, okay? So if you think about it, it's kind of like a very weird kind of condition, okay? But it's sort of like maybe superficially plausible. So if the attack works by joining an external database with a de-identified database on the common quasi-identifier, let's make sure that in every join there's going to be at least like K records that match the record in the external data set. All right? So this example might help a little bit. So you know you're trying to identify a person in the release table, but the only information you have birth date and gender, and there are at least like K people with that birth date and gender, and like you don't know which one of them is your victim, at which point presumably you like give up and go away. I mean, I wouldn't go away, but like somebody would, okay? So that's the basic intuition behind K-anonymity. So this whole, idea could be made a little more formal. So you can say, I take a private table, I release it, it has certain attributes. I'm going to say that some subset of them are quasi-identifiers. What does it mean that it's how do I know which of them are quasi-identifiers? Well, maybe somehow I know. I have some a priori notion that some subset of attributes is identifying, and I'll make sure that every tuple of quasi-identifiers appears at least K occurrence, it has at least K occurrences in the released data set. My goal here is to make each record in the released data set indistinguishable from at least K-1 other records. Obviously, I'm not achieving this goal here, but all I'm doing is that I'm making it's indistinguishable, provided the adversary is only looking at quasi-identifiers. Then just by looking at quasi-identifiers, you cannot distinguish them because they're K of each. Okay, so how would you achieve something like this? Turns out there is a huge literature in database community. They like publishing papers on K-anonymity, and lots of interesting algorithms in there that aim to produce like various useful K-anonymizations. Kind of sort of as a little kind of editorial aside here. As you can see, like this property, this property stated here, it's a syntactic property of the data set, okay? It has nothing to do, it doesn't say anything about like being able to infer anything from it, about hiding anything. It's a very simple syntactic property, like That's why people actually like it so much. Because, for example, it's very simple to check if the data set satisfies K-anonymity, okay? And like most syntactic properties, you can come up with all sorts of like, efficient ways of achieving it. So we'll see in a moment what it implies or doesn't imply. So how would you achieve something like this? So typically, the algorithms that people have proposed for achieving K-anonymity, they use some combination of generalization and suppression. So generalization is a simple trick where you look at your quasi-identifiers and you start like coarsening them. You start making them more less and less specific until you get K of each, okay? So if you think about zip code, the zip codes are all distinct. Okay, let's keep the first 3 digits of the zip code. Oops, now like a bunch of zip codes kind of merge into one equivalence class. If ages are distinct, let's bucketize them, okay? Let's put them into buckets, and now they become less distinct. So you can see how that sort of reduces the, I don't know what's the right term, like the resolution of the data in the data set. So you do that, but of course, if you have outliers there, then you're going to lose all information if you generalize. So for outliers, you do an even simpler trick, you suppress, okay? So by massaging the data with some combination of generalization and suppression, and like I said, there are lots of algorithms. I'm not even going into what they do because that's not so interesting. What's much more interesting is what they're really achieving by doing this. But by cleverly playing with combination of generalization and suppression, they produce data sets where for each, there are K of each value of quasi-identifier. So this is kind of an example of a generalization lattice here. You can kind of see how something like this might work. So this is an example of a K-anonymous table that results from this process. You can see zip codes have been generalized somewhat. I guess this one doesn't have suppressions. Okay, anyway, so this would be an example of a two anonymous table where you assume that the quasi-identifier is a combination of race, birth, gender, and zip. So these techniques are still used all over the place for protecting information. And at this point, you might conclude that everything is safe because now, if you have an external data source, like our favorite example, voter database, and try to link it with this data set, the join is not going to yield a unique record. This record in the external data set, there are 3 possible records it could match based on quasi-identifiers, and I guess at this point the attacker gives up and goes away. Here is another example of generalization, and you can see this one uses some suppression because gender had to be suppressed. Otherwise, you don't get 2 anonymity, or 3 anonymity in this case. So same idea is that if you perform a linkage with an external data set, you get at least K records as the result of the linkage. However, you might notice something a little strange in this example of 3 anonymity. So you can stare at this for a while. So now it looks like we might have a problem, which is that on the one hand, linkage has failed, right? As in, like, I have an external data set, but that I can link with, and I don't know which of the 3 records it matched. On the other hand, if I really worry about privacy, it seems that an adversary with like a very small amount of biological knowledge could probably infer Alice's condition from the result of this linkage. And maybe by looking at this example, it's time to start asking questions. Okay, that's maybe a nice procedure, and it does like, it prevents linkage in some form. But in terms of actual privacy and actually preventing someone from learning something, does it actually give us all that much? Before I go into this, I should mention that even if you take even if you take like sort of K-anonymity on faith as a meaningful notion of privacy protection, just applying it actually is not all that easy, because this whole trick of generalization, it fundamentally assumes some kind of spatial locality. Every record must have some neighbors, and this, if you look at its quasi-identifiers, otherwise by the time you generalize to a meaningful value of K, you no longer, you lost all information. And as I'll be talking a lot kind of later this morning, this locality actually doesn't exist. Like for many real-world databases, once we look at what might be conceivably thought of as a quasi-identifier in those databases, it's like every subset is a feasible quasi-identifier, and there are no nearest neighbors. So, and this is kind of a well-known problem in database research. Like the curse of dimensionality is not a new thing, but it really bites pretty hard if you try to apply K-anonymity to real data sets. Like the only way K-anonymity would work, apart from its privacy protections, just like algorithmically, you wouldn't lose all information, if you really need to like define quasi-identifiers very, very narrowly. Once you start dealing with like broader notions of quasi-identifiers, K-anonymity just produces useless data sets. But that's kind of like an aside here. Now let's talk about what kind of privacy protection it provides. So there are maybe several things we might want from like privacy in a medical data set. And I mean, these are not the same thing. I mean, they're related, but so one I'd call membership disclosure. Maybe we don't want an attacker to tell that a given person in the data set. Maybe the attacker has someone in mind and they should not be able to verify that that person in the data set. So that's one notion of privacy. Another notion of privacy is I'll call sensitive attribute disclosure, where an attacker cannot tell that, like maybe you can tell that a person is in the data set, okay, so you can figure out somebody is a patient of some clinic, but you shouldn't be able to tell the value of a certain attribute. And yet another form of privacy is what I'll call identity disclosure, is that, okay, I know the person, maybe I know that person is in the data set, but I don't know which record corresponds to which person. So which of these does K-anonymity give us? So I like to kind of, keep my audience in suspense. Unfortunately, in this case, my audience has the answer printed on a piece of paper in front of them, so I won't do that. So K-anonymity, at best, gives like some form of identity disclosure. So assuming that the only thing the attacker knows is a quasi-identifier, that's a very restricted attacker. That's like a really dumb attacker. Assuming the only thing they know is a quasi-identifier, record linkage fails in the following sense, that given an auxiliary information that has the same quasi-identifier, I don't know which of the records or which of K records in the original data set corresponds to my target. First of all, this, as I'll show you, this assumption is actually usually not true, but even if that assumption were true, that whole property of identity disclosure, by itself, it doesn't imply anything that anyone commonly understands as privacy. The easiest way to illustrate is like, okay, what if I got K records and they all have the same sensitive attribute? Okay, I don't need to know which of these records correspond to my target, because then I know that they have this attribute because they all have that attribute. The thing that is really weird about K-anonymity, if you think about the definition and kind of come back to this notion of like, for every quasi-identifier, it has to occur at least K-1 time in the data set. Let me give you an easy way of achieving K-anonymity. Take every record in the data set and duplicate it K-1 times and publish the resulting data set. Okay? Just create like K-1 copies of every record in the data set and publish. I mean, obviously, you're releasing exactly the same information as was in the original data set, just like K times, and yet that data set satisfies the definition of K-anonymity, which tells you just how strange that definition is as trying to capture something about privacy. So now let's talk about various ways in which K-anonymity fails. So one, That one is more like, kind of funny one. So it turns out that some early implementations of K-anonymity, they would apply K-anonymity, but then would release records in the same order as in the original table. So this is so-called unsorted matching attack. That's just like a weird attack. So it's easily solved by randomizing the order of the records, but it just kind of tells you like how little people are thinking about it. Another way in which, so I actually like this paper a lot. So I was talking to Adam. Where is Adam here? Yeah, there he is. It's his paper and his crew. Yeah, I was talking to him like last year, and he was like complaining to me how he never published an attack paper in his life. And I'm like, not only you published an attack paper, it's like a pretty awesome attack paper. So I'm not going to go into it in detail. You can like buttonhole him during the coffee break. But it's really kind of nice illustration of how brittle it is, where you can just take the same underlying data, release it twice, both times it's a K-anonymous release, and then just from two releases, you can reconstruct the original data, okay? So it doesn't compose and like, I mean, the privacy property, whatever K-anonymity gives you, it doesn't compose, and it doesn't compose in like pretty bad way. Like given multiple releases, you can just reconstruct what the underlying data is. Just by looking at these independent releases and leaking them. But you can do many other things. Even if you don't have access to complementary releases and you want to break K-anonymity, you can actually exploit your knowledge about the data. And that example that I showed you before, where you get a 3 anonymous data release and even a little bit of biological knowledge allows you to infer something about the victim, that's an example of this. So if an attacker has background knowledge, or if you manage to release the sensitive attributes, but in that equivalence class defined by the quasi-identifiers, they're not actually diverse, you leak information. So here is an example of a 3 anonymous patient table, and you can see that even though it satisfies the definition of 3 anonymity, for some classes it actually doesn't hide sensitive attribute at all, because inside that equivalence class they all have exactly the same sensitive attribute, meaning that even though I cannot link the record of some patient to any particular record in this data set, I know their condition. Nevertheless, this is known as homogeneity attack, that if you look at this as external information, you can see that this is going to map. I don't know which record it maps to. I just know an equivalence class of 3 records. Those would be the first 3 records in the first equivalence class there, and I can immediately infer the person's medical condition from that. Even though K-anonymity holds and record linkage fails, I can still do things here. And this is another example of an attack, this so-called background knowledge attack. By linking to this class, maybe I don't learn the condition exactly, but if I know something about the distribution, for example, of very sensitive attributes in the population, or I have some prior knowledge that gives me something about the person, I can exploit the distributional information that is leaked here. So these observations and these weaknesses in K-anonymity gave rise to another concept, another attempt to fix these issues. And this is something called L-diversity. So that's a little newer than K-anonymity. Turned out to be a hugely influential paper. It has like, I don't know, 4,000 citations on Google Scholar, something like that. Massively, massively influential. And L-diversity is based on a kind of pretty simple idea here, which is we're going to do K-anonymity, and then we're going to look inside every equivalence class defined by K-anonymity, and we'll ensure that sensitive attributes are diverse within each quasi-identifier equivalence class. Okay, so that'll take care of this homogeneity attack. So there are several ways to define it. One of them is that each equivalence class has at least L well-represented sensitive values. That in itself doesn't actually prevent probabilistic inference attacks. in part because their diversity requirement, this sort of notion of well-represented, in this case, it's actually not related to how common certain attributes are in the population, which means that you can have something that's very diverse by some kind of, metric of diversity that's based on its commonality in the equivalence class defined in the release table, but just based on like biological knowledge or knowledge about distribution of the population, you could still be inferring things. They also have other versions of what it means to be diverse. There is something called probabilistic diversity, where the frequency of the most frequent value is bounded. A variant of this that they call entropy diversity. So lots of definitions in there. So I will break this in like 5 minutes. But before I do this, I want to show you these charts. So they come directly from the L diversity paper. And I find them like stunning in some sense. Like over the dinner, I think yesterday, I was telling Adam and John how there are 3 papers. I'm going to only talk about 2 in this cycle of lectures, but there are 3 papers in the history of privacy research that I think are sort of like very educational, although maybe not in the way their authors intended. There is a paper by Agrawal and Srikant on privacy preserving data mining. I'm not going to be covering that paper. I'll spare you. Then there is the L diversity paper that I'm talking about now, and there is the model and version paper, the pharmacogenetics paper that I'm going to talk about on Wednesday. Each one of them contains a chart that is somehow stunning to me. So this is the chart from L diversity paper. And actually, it took me a while. I looked at it a few times, but it took me like a year before I actually noticed how strange this chart is. And actually, this has nothing to do with privacy, per se, except that it kind of shows you very concretely how syntactic definitions of privacy like make no sense at all. So just, sorry, I know it's kind of like an aside, but I think since, presumably you're here because you're interested in privacy research and you want to learn how to do this right and so on, let's just look at these charts because these are very amazing illustrations of like how not to do it. As you can see in these charts, they're comparing L diversity and the original K-anonymity, okay? And basically they take a value, okay, like, 2, 3, 4, 6, and they compare, let's compare like 6 anonymity with 6 diversity, okay? Or like 2 anonymity with 2 diversity, and they show you how, one is more efficient to compute or how you get like some better property out of one and the other. But okay, that seems like reasonably legit, considering, yeah? You cannot read the y-axis. Actually, you know what? Actually, y-axis doesn't matter on this side. Like the stunning part here is the x-axis. And here is, does anybody actually notice anything like super strange about like comparing L diversity and K-anonymity? I just talked about this. You know what K-anonymity is, I told you, it's K defines the size of equivalence class on quasi-identifiers, and L, if you forgot what it is, that's what L is. In case of here they're looking at entropy L diversity, so they say the distribution of sensitive values in each equivalence class is at least logarithm of L. So anybody notices anything about this? Yeah, like what's actually the domain of K? Like how small can K be? Like K varies from what to what? So K is the number of records that coincide on quasi-identifiers, so the smallest value of K is what? 1, right? And the biggest value of K is the size of the database. Whereas L varies from what to what? No, I mean, if it's entropy L diversity, so that is totally determined by the nature of the data. Like, for example, if you have like, if your sensitive attribute is something like HIV status, which is binary, how big of an L can you get there? If you have, like, L is determined by the number of, so if you look at this chart, like, it compares, like, I don't know, apples and bicycles, like on x-axis. I don't even know what it's measuring. It's like it takes two numbers which literally have nothing to do with each other. I mean, they're in different domains. They're like completely incomparable. It's like one has to do with the size of the database and the other has to do with the distribution of like sensitive values in the medical data set and like how many distinct medical codes you can have. So what is, I mean, like somehow nobody seems amazed by how like insane this is, but if you stare at it, you'll realize how insane. Like maybe I'm not explaining it well, but this is really like a stunningly weird and kind of chart. It's trying to compare things that have different, completely different meaning, completely different dimensions. Okay, whatever. All right. So, but going back to L diversity here. Again, it looks at some property of distributions that has to do with distributions of data in the equivalence class. But if we look at our medical example, so if your sensitive attribute is such that its distribution is heavily biased in the population, things have very different sensitivity, right? So the sensitivity of revealing that somebody is HIV positive is much higher than revealing that they're HIV negative. And what this tells you is that on the one hand, for something like this, it's even unnecessary. So like you don't want L diversity for an equivalence class that's like this. I mean, for HIV status, because sort of your base rate is that it's negative. And so you can have a non-diverse equivalence class where the vast majority of people are HIV negative, and that in itself is not sensitive. So in that sense, L diversity is an overkill, but it's also going to be very hard to achieve in this case because you're trying to make a very rare attribute well represented in the equivalence class, which is going to require like a huge amount of like merging classes and removing information from the data set to achieve diversity where you don't need it. And furthermore, by itself, again, because of this skewed distributions of sensitive attributes that you deal with in the population, even if you achieve it, it doesn't necessarily guarantee privacy because you could be revealing information even if you're well represented because you're shifting the distribution significantly versus what it is in the adversaries prior. So there is a huge gain of adversaries' knowledge because by introducing diversity there, you effectively shifted by a lot what the adversary knows about learns from the fact that somebody's record falls into a particular equivalence class. And from the viewpoint of L diversity, there is no difference between these two equivalence classes because they have exactly the same L diversity metric, even though you learn, like an attacker would learn much, much more by learning that somebody's record is in the first equivalence class than by learning that if their record is in the second equivalence class. So it doesn't, look at overall distribution of sensitive values. So now let's look at something like this. So this is yet another way of kind of inferring information from L diverse or K-anonymous, what have you, data set, where maybe, I mean, everything is diverse. Maybe you cannot map to a particular record, but still you're learning things from this linkage. Because the information that is leaked by this release does restrict the set of possible sensitive attributes that the target might have. It does, in this case, somehow salaries in the data set, so it does restrict the adversary's knowledge about this. It increases adversary's knowledge about this. So there is clearly massive information leakage happening there, which is not captured by any of these syntactic notions of how well represented different attributes are. So, and again, why is this happening? Because fundamentally, it's a syntactic notion. Okay, it's based purely on trying to measure something about the distribution of things in this equivalence class. It doesn't consider semantics of sensitive values at all. Well, you know, I'm not going to bore you with 5 alternative notions of, you know, there is M invariance and something else that came after L diversity. There was another called T closeness, which tries to fix some of the problems in L diversity. So in this one, it says that the distribution of values within each quasi-identifier equivalence class should be close to the distribution in the entire original database. But at this point, you might sort of start asking kinds of questions like, why are you publishing quasi-identifiers at all? Why not just split database in half and just publish the distributions? Kind of actually unclear what the answer to that is. Here is another issue. So here we have a data set that's actually K-anonymous, L-diverse, T-close that satisfies kind of every syntactic notion that everybody has come up with. And here is an adversary comes in with a certain kind of knowledge and tries to perform linkage attack. And the linkage attack actually, in this case, uniquely identifies a record. And people always, well, I mean, people who come from that side of the world where they publish those kinds of papers, they always object to this attack. Because they claim this is not an attack, that somehow this attack violates the rules, okay? So what is the rule? It's because now I'm performing linkage on something that is I'm giving myself an unfair advantage. I'm performing linkage, I mean, clearly, it leaks sensitive information, but this is against the rules because now I'm using as my external information something that is not a quasi-identifier, okay? Because so far, I mean, until this moment, I played by the rules. I only use things that are present in the voter list, the same voter list that Latanya Sweeney used 20 years ago. And here me, kind of hitting below the belt and using as part of my auxiliary information something that wasn't part of quasi-identifier, and that allows me to do very accurate linkage here. That actually yields a unique record. I don't even have to go through the reasoning, what do I learn from the equivalence class? I get a unique record. But I would argue that that's kind of yet another problem, is that in reality, when we look at the kind of attacks that people do and the kind of privacy breaches that I alluded to in the beginning, and I'm going to show you a concrete example in a moment here, that's how they happen. It's like the attacker has some information that's like a quasi-identifier, and they often have something extra. They often know something about the person that was not traditionally considered a quasi-identifier, and it isn't because it's not unique in the data set. I mean, sorry, in the population. However, if you take a quasi-identifier plus that extra, that completely breaks apart these syntactic protections that these methods provide. There is something called HIPAA privacy rule. So this is the part of laws in America that governs privacy of medical data. It's kind of very subtle. So this part of the rule, it basically prescribes some form of K-anonymity. So this syntactic techniques that I talked about for the past hour, and I know we're overdue for a break, so we're gonna break it.
Can you remind people
What? Yeah. So, sorry, I was gonna say this. Yeah, this was an aside. So a few years ago in America, as part of some health insurance reform or something, they adopted a law that prescribes privacy protection of medical records. Okay? This is kind of one of these laws. I mean, as a consumer in America, the only way you encounter it is when you come to a doctor's office and nobody's going to treat you unless you waive all your rights under this law. So that's not the topic of this school. But anyhow, at least on paper, this law exists. And among other things, it tells people who hold medical data to protect privacy of these data sets if they're going to share it with someone, if they're going to release it for medical studies or share it with another provider and so on. And this is the description of how this protection should be done. And it pretty much like codifies K-anonymity into law. Okay, so and the effect of this is to provide something called safe harbor, meaning that if you do this, you're not liable. So you did to the best standard known to people who drafted this law, you protected privacy of the data if you performed this kind of K-anonymous transformation, such as it is. It does have like this weird clause saying that have no actual knowledge that whoever is doing this should not have any knowledge that the information remaining after this transformation could be used alone or in combination with something else to identify a subject of transformation. And so I actually don't, I'm not a lawyer, I don't know what this means, but I would claim that at this point we actually pretty much have actual knowledge, or should have actual knowledge, that the information remaining after this K-anonymous and transformations can be used to identify people in the data set, or at any rate, even if you cannot identify them, to infer something sensitive about them. And let me describe an example that kind of illustrates how these things work, and then I think we can take a little break here. More than 10 years ago, feels like yesterday, but more than 10 years ago, AOL released anonymized search query logs. People search for things on AOL, and they released something like 20 million queries from more than 500,000 users. And on the one hand, the purpose of this was to enable better like data mining research, and so people can analyze what folks are searching for. But they also worried about privacy, and they aim to protect privacy of AOL users, both because of government and because of regulation and because they don't want to harm their users. So they removed, so you could see all searches performed by the user, but the users were anonymous, and information was removed. But the content of the searches was there. So all of these query logs have this form. So there is this anonymous ID, then the search, the time the search was performed, and the URL they clicked on. And some New York Times reporter looked at just particular user, so that's the actual number of that user, and noticed that that user performed searches for like single men over 60, and what to do with the dog that like pees everywhere, looking for landscapers in some little town, Lilburn, Georgia, and searching for people with a particular last name. And it turns out that if you take a phone book and look at population of Lilburn, Georgia, which is not a big place to start with, there are only like 14 people with last name Arnold in there, which was the common last name in the searches of that user. So what the New York Times reporter did is just dialed up all of them, and until one of them said, yeah, I'm Thelma Arnold, these are my searches, and by the way, if you know like a nice older gentleman who is like looking to get married, like let me know. So that's a quintessential example of how you can use information that is not a quasi-identifier. Well, I mean, at least not by conventional definition of a quasi-identifier. Look, there are plenty of people there, there are like thousands of people in Lilburn, Georgia, and there are lots of people who look for partnership in their older years. But somehow taken together, they uniquely identify a particular user. And that's why this whole notion that underlies techniques like K-anonymity and L-diversity, that you can a priori decide that some subset of attributes is going to be quasi-identifying, maybe that whole assumption is actually pretty badly flawed, because in any real privacy breach, like what happened here, you never know which combination of attributes is actually going to be identifying. So let me conclude this part of the lecture with several kind of lessons to take home. The problem with anonymization approaches is that they are largely syntactic. They focus fundamentally on transforming data in some kind of way, not what can be learned from the anonymized data set. Inevitably, this results in data sets that leak sensitive information. They all suffer from what I call the quasi-identifier fallacy. They assume that adversary's knowledge is going to be limited to a certain set of attributes. They're all inspired, but not like in a good way, by that like Latanya Sweeney attack from 20 years ago. The attack is real enough, and it's very motivating, but it's like sort of motivating the wrong thing. They're trying to cure the symptom and not the cause. They're trying to prevent that particular attack from going through. And maybe they do, but like there are, as I'm trying to show you, there are many ways to learn information from an anonymized data set other than joining it with a voter list based on date of birth, gender, and zip code. So this notion that you can like define one ultimate set of attributes and call it a quasi-identifier and that's all the attacker is going to know, that's just not a realistic assumption in this day and age. And also, it actually doesn't even work all that well because it relies on locality, and if you're dealing with data sets, which is like of the kind that I'm going to show you in the next, in the second lecture today, they actually don't have that locality, meaning that the records are so far apart from each other once you start applying K-anonymity or L-diversity and start merging, like there is no information left once you get equivalent classes. Yeah, the myth of the PII. Well, how about we take a break and I'll continue from this point after a break. Thanks.